Very glad to have you all here and to be doing this, presenting Mollie Ziegler Hemmingway, speaking on religious liberty, as well as the media. Dr. Kopp will give an introduction of Mollie, but I want to come out and first of all, thank you all for being here. Thank the University of Colorado for letting us do this. That's a nice thing, as in California right now, InterVarsity has just been de-recognized as a student group, and things like this might not be able to take place. We thank the University of Colorado for allowing this. Thank you all for being here as well. And one final thank you, although he's not here yet. I wanted to very much thank Mollie's dad, Pastor Larry Ziegler. He'll be coming in at some point. We can all say hello to him when he gets here. He is retiring after about 40 plus years in the ministry. He's a pastor down in Castle Rock, and that's one of the reasons Mollie's able to be with us as she's coming out for his retirement service. And we were able to tie these two trips into one thing, so she gets to go see her family and then also be there for the service. But he's not here to thank him, so we'll do that some other time. One other thing is we are going to have a reception back at our chapel. You can find a pretty horrible map on the back of this. It's got a little dot leading you where you're supposed to go, and also for some reason it sends you south and then back up north, which doesn't make sense. But basically, if you just head east, you'll find it. It's right on the corner of Colorado and Folsom. University's football stadium is right there. We're right across the street. We welcome you all to join us back there for a reception after this talk and presentation. With that, I hand it over to Dr. Kopp to introduce Mollie.
Thank you, Pastor Bob. It's great to see everybody here. My name is Christian Kopf. I'm Associate Director of the Honors Program at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm a faculty member here and a member of both sponsoring groups, the University Lutheran Chapel and the Colorado Association of Scholars, the state affiliate of the National Association of Scholars, a faculty group. But it's my great pleasure to introduce Mollie Ziegler Hemmingway. Mollie is a Coloradan. She is a graduate of the University of Colorado, Denver, recipient of the prestigious Phillips Foundation Journalism Fellowship in 2004. She's made a name for herself as a journalist and a blogger. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, in addition to those rather dubious sources, also Christianity Today. She is currently senior editor at the Federalist. Our blogs on religious freedom, and the way religion is covered by the media have made quite a name for themselves. You'll partly notice this from the people who use her work but don't mention her. But it's also true that you see your name mentioned in the Telegraph in London, National Review Online. Those few among us who watch the Megyn Kelly file will also have seen her there and remember why we're watching that show and not Wolf Blitzer. Because of the intelligent analysis of current events that's going on. And it's great to have a chance to have her here to speak to us at the University of Colorado. We're very grateful this has worked out, and I'd like you to welcome Mollie Ziegler Hemmingway, who will speak on religious freedom and the press.
I'm very excited to be here. I just realized that the last time I was here was when I was 15. I sat in the back row up here, and a band called PIL, which is short, you don't know who this band is, but they're a punk band for Public Image Limited. It was my first real concert, and I've always wondered, where was that place I went to in Boulder with these older kids? And it's here, and now I'm back. And last time I was here, it was Johnny Rotten on the stage, shredding, but I'm sure it'll be just as exciting or terrifying for you as it was. But yeah, so I wanted to talk about, hi Mom. I do just want to point out real quick, this is my father, Larry Ziegler. I'm glad you could make it, Mom and Dad, that's great. But to talk about religious liberty, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got interested in those topics and tell you a little bit about my background, my parents are both converts to Lutheranism, and they raised my brother and my sister and I to value that very highly. And I was baptized at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Kemmerer, Wyoming. Yeah. And then we moved to Terabella, California, the Central Valley of California, where my dad was pastor for 8 years. And then he received a call to Mount Zion Lutheran Church in Castle Rock, which is where all 3 of us were confirmed. And I studied economics at the University of Colorado, Denver. I don't think I was good enough to get into. You people are very smart who go to CU Boulder, and I was not at that level. So I hacked it out at CU Denver, and nothing, to show for it. But moved to Washington, D.C., and I was working in nonprofit management, and I absolutely hated it. I mean, I hated every day of it, but I was also good at it, so I kept getting promoted into jobs that paid better, and I really liked the money. And I began to think about what is it that I really want to do with my life, and I noticed that all my friends who were reporters really enjoyed their jobs. They really seemed to just, they never complained about their jobs. They loved what they were doing, and I thought, I kind of want to do that, and I did yearbook in high school, and I tried to do newspaper in college. Like, maybe that would be something I'd be interested in. But every time they told me how much money they made, I said, there's no way I could do it. And I'd also thought a little bit about going into church work, and I thought about going to seminary and studying theology, maybe serving the church as a deaconess. And I talked to my parents about it, and my dad said he thought that was just a wonderful idea. Thought that was really wonderful, and that he'd totally support me. And my mom said that she just wanted me to know that you don't need to work in the church in order to serve God. You can serve God through many different vocations, and you don't need to do church work to do that. So ruminating on that and thinking about journalism, I got fired from my job. Good times, great times. And I suddenly realized that the really bad pay of journalism was more than the $0 that I was getting as a fired person. So I tried to get a job, and it was right after September 11th, and the advertising industry kind of tanked, which means that the journalism industry was tanking, and so I was competing with people who were getting laid off from the Washington Post after 30 years for jobs. And there was an opening at a place called Radio y Musica, and the only thing was you needed to speak Spanish in order to work there, which technically I don't speak Spanish. And but it turns out that I do speak Spanish if I'm worried about paying rent. Then all of a sudden it just comes, or maybe a glass or two of wine also helps. But, so I answered the phones in Spanish and English, and I made coffee and delivered faxes, and I was really happy to just be working at a newspaper. And my English-speaking boss, because there was a sister publication, Radio and Records, let me write some stories. And usually they were really boring stories, like you listen in on earnings calls and write up a report. But he let me do one of my own making, where I covered a hearing on Capitol Hill, and I did some, shoe leather reporting, and it went on the front page of the English version of the publication. And when that happened, I was just completely hooked. It was simple. I knew this was what I wanted to do, and it just stuck. But maybe not covering Spanish language radio and reporting. So at the same time that was going on, there was something going on in my church body that was very frustrating to me because of the media coverage of the thing. And so, as everyone who's here who's Lutheran knows, we don't do syncretistic worship services, which makes us very unique among Americans, because most Americans do interfaith worship. And we don't, and it was a really important thing that relates to how we even came to this country. We were being forced to worship with people who did not share our confessional subscription, and it was such a big issue for us that many of us came over to this country. So it's a very important issue. But we had this one pastor who did it anyway in the aftermath of 9/11, and of course all the media, and that him doing that made people upset because they wanted to reaffirm our teachings on the first table of the commandments and our understanding of not having God share altar space with other gods and whatnot. And the media just did not get this. And I remember one night watching Fox News with Bill O'Reilly, and he said, I just don't think these Missouri Synod Lutherans are Christian if they don't let this happen. Oh, something happened in me. I got very angry, and I thought, they just don't understand what our teaching is. They don't understand why we do this, why this is so important to us, and why this country should allow us to have this unique belief, even though it's not fitting the patriotism of the moment. So I wrote it up, and I said, I just want as many people to read this as possible. And I had, so I just made a list by circulation of the newspapers in the country, and I'm just going to start at the top and work my way down until someone takes it. So I started at the Wall Street Journal, which had the top circulation, and I have no idea how this happened, but they took it. They're like, yeah, that sounds great. So I was like, well, that was easy. And then they edited it really nicely and whatnot. And it was great because I was able to explain something, a complex situation, and I did it in a newsy way, but I was able to at least get the arguments out there. And it was a wonderful experience, and I ended up I've written for the Wall Street Journal Houses of Worship column ever since on any number of topics, any number of religions. That, last year I got to cover the Dalai Lama for them. I get to do a wide variety of religious stuff. But I was trying to figure out, exactly what my journalism career would be. I knew I liked writing about religion. I knew I liked writing about baseball a lot. And I also liked writing about economics, but it seemed that the greatest need was with religion reporting, because newsrooms really struggle with religion reporting. I lost that job too, that Radio and Records, Radio and Musica job. We all got laid off, one day, and again, really bad time to get laid off in the market, and months went by and no jobs were coming up, and I thought about maybe I could move home and live with my parents, and called my dad, and he was like, absolutely, you're more than welcome to come home. And then I talked to my mom, and she said, absolutely not. So that was nice of her. And but no, she really thought that I should just keep trying out in DC. And sure enough, I got a job at this newspaper that covered management of the federal government. And they were looking for someone to cover their waste, fraud, and mismanagement beat. And I distinctly remember in the interview, they said, could you tell us if you have any story ideas? Because we've really had trouble with this position. It seems that nobody can come up with any story ideas. On the waste, fraud, and mismanagement beat in federal government, I think I maybe went through about a dozen that came, off the top of my head. We're hired, and so I actually worked at that newspaper for a very long time and never lacked for story ideas. And but it was interesting being there and being in that it was a large newsroom environment. There were a number of different papers that covered different aspects of the federal government: Army Times, Navy Times, Marine Times, Space News. And so we were all in this huge newsroom that you feel like is in one of the movies, the clickety-clackety, people yelling at their sources. And it was a great experience, but it was also really interesting to me because I learned a lot about, again, the ignorance of a lot of reporters when it comes to religion. And I don't know exactly why this happens, but a lot of people who go into journalism all have the same backgrounds. They have roughly the same socioeconomic background, and a lot of them are not terribly religious. And a good example of this is that I went to Ash Wednesday services in the morning before going to work one day, and with a friend, and when we arrived at work, she was Catholic, and when we arrived at work, people kept telling us we had dirt on our foreheads. And you have to think about how sheltered someone must be to not know about Ash Wednesday. I mean, Christianity is the majority religion in this country. It's not like Catholics and Lutherans are a small portion of that population, and it just kind of speaks to the sheltered nature of a lot of reporters. It's not like they're trying to be mean about religion even half the time. They just don't have a really good base of knowledge. And frequently they're going to journalism school where you're not, expected to learn anything about religion or whatnot. I also had a friend who was working on a story who wanted to know what percentage of Christians were snake handlers. Like it was, you know, is it more than 10? About 10? And just like really good-hearted questions, like not understanding what Pentecostalism is or anything. I mean, they just really don't know much. And so anyway, I continued to write about religion during that time, and in particular, I got hooked up with this media criticism site called Get Religion. And what we do there is look at how well the mainstream media handles religion news. And all the people who work there are people who have experience in secular newsrooms, who appreciate the American model of journalism, who understand how hard it is to write multiple stories on deadline. And then we just look at stories and then we try and critique with compassion for the difficulties of being a journalist. And again, we always have tons of examples of things that the media get wrong. And they kind of fall into different categories. I mean, I think first and foremost, what you see with media coverage of religion is that it's heavily focused on politics. So if you are not a political church body, you almost receive no coverage. So if you are like the Episcopal Church and you're weighing in on SUV tire regulations, they love that. They will cover your church body doing it. If you don't think that's the proper role of the church, they kind of don't know how to cover you. So also, the whole point of news is that it's new. And so there's kind of a built-in bias against those churches that don't change every month what they're doing. And so if you are a liturgical, ancient, historical, traditional church, the media also sort of don't know how to cover that because they don't know how to see the new things that are happening in such a church environment. And then also, you know, things like, so if politics is what you're focused on, the media get that. Let's say forgiveness is what you're focused on. Well, that's a much more difficult story to tell in the pages of a newspaper. And since newsrooms are getting cut and people don't spend the time they do with stories, they just don't cover the things that we think are important. And then finally with social issues, I think that's where people have started to see the biggest disconnect between the values of people who are in mainstream media and people who are not. And for them, it's very hard to cover any issues that have anything to do with sexual morality with even a semblance of dispassion. I mean, they can't do it. You read the papers, you see the TV, you see how it's like beyond their intellectual capacity. Okay, so Get Religion, yeah, left that one newspaper mostly because I got married and had my first daughter and I wanted to work from home and just do more freelancing stuff. So I really focused just on religion reporting at that time. And then about a year ago, we started this website called The Federalist, which covers culture and policy and politics, and we're secular, but we cover religion, and we're happy to have religious voices as part of our stable of writers. And so I've gotten to do a lot more religious liberty there. I think that covers the high points. That was riveting, I know you guys were very anyway, while I was at Get Religion, there was a story that I thought really spoke to the trouble of the mainstream media to handle social issues. And the story was, and it's very awful, so I will try not to give so many details, but an abortion doctor in Philadelphia was busted as part of like a drug operation. Basically, he was suspected of handing out prescription drugs to patients that should not have had them. So I think the DEA went into his clinic, and when they went into there, they found what they called a house of horrors. It was unbelievable. I don't even know if I can talk about it without crying, but they found like remains of so he was sort of had a specialty of late-term abortions, and he would deliver the children fully and then snip their spinal cords, and then also sometimes preserve them in jars or preserve trophies from each child, like feet or hands. We'd keep them in the refrigerator with the staff food. He had cats in the clinic, and they had urine everywhere. He was a hoarder, so his hallways were so narrow and filled with stuff that he once killed a woman by over anesthetizing her. How would you say this? Whatever, you know what I'm getting at. And one of the problems when they did like they wouldn't have been able to even get her out of the clinic because of the hallway situation. There were other reports of women who were permanently sterilized because of how he did his things. He was known and actually kind of celebrated in the abortion rights community for something that he had done decades earlier, which was called a Mother's Day special. He'd come up with a method of abortion, and he wanted to try it out on Mother's Day, and he had like bound together like a coil of like metallic objects and then like inserted it into the uterus and let it expand. And he did it all on Mother's Day, and it was basically like gruesome. But it was before abortion was fully legalized or something, so people kind of just celebrated that he was a renegade, or I mean, I can't really get into the logic of all that, but basically he'd been running this horribly disgusting clinic for decades without even the tiniest amount of oversight from any agency, or even like an abortion rights group that supposedly goes in and checks on clinics and whatnot. And when it came out, mostly came out in a grand jury report. It was the most like riveting reading you could imagine. I mean, American born and bred serial killer targeting infants, women, like to prey on immigrant women and women of color, like any angle you want to go with. Failures in the healthcare industry, you know, taking advantage of immigrants, killing babies is usually something that gets people's attention. And he'd been doing this, you know, in a serial manner over many years. And it was interesting because it wasn't that the media didn't cover it. They did when it came out. It was impossible to ignore. And that night on the news, most people covered it. And I thought, well, this is going to be interesting. The next few years here are going to be interesting as we see how they cover this. They didn't. They just mentioned it one night, and then they moved on. And, you know, I'd written about it, how I thought that this should have more coverage. I'd written about it quite a bit. And I kind of convinced myself that once it went to trial, well, then they'd have to cover it, because I know American media, and I know they love trials. So this will be definitely, finally, the coverage that we've been waiting for. And they'll have to get into all the details, and they'll have to discuss all the policy implications. And they'll have to talk about the baby that, you know, that he said was big enough to walk to the bus stop before he snipped his neck, or the baby that was gasping in a toilet bowl as they tried to drown. I mean, the grand jury report is horrible. I'm very sorry, because I know that, you know, it's difficult to hear and everything, but it's also important to hear things that are actually happening and not have this news hidden from us. But as the trial happened, you know, AP had like a local reporter on it. There were a few local reporters, but still the national media didn't cover it. And because I'd written about it for years and I'd grown very frustrated that nobody else seemed to care about this issue, I decided to just start asking reporters personally why they were part of this blackout. I wanted them to answer for themselves. Like, it's easy to be like, oh, my paper doesn't have enough resources. But I started looking at the reporters who cover these types of topics in general. You know, the types of reporters who, if the Susan G. Komen Foundation doesn't want to give money to Planned Parenthood, they write 18 stories about it. The type of reporter who, if a Senate candidate in Missouri says something stupid about rape, they write 340 stories about it. Or, you know, the type of reporter who just glows as they interview the person who's doing the filibuster on abortion in Texas. You know, those types of reporters who normally cover abortion policy or abortion in general. I wanted to know why they weren't covering it. And so I just started asking them and hammering them. And everyone, you know, could see it because I was doing it on Twitter. I'm sure you guys are far too smart to be on Twitter, but it's a really fun tool for journalists. And you get to interact with other journalists, and you get to ask them questions, you get to find sources, you get to interact with your readers. It's great. So I was asking people, and one thing I thought was interesting was a lot of people were cheering me on. Like, yeah, we want to know that too. And that's what made it also particularly interesting, was that people wanted the stories, but they weren't getting them. Like, if you went to Politico, which is a big website out in DC, they show what their most searched terms are. And so you would see, most searched term, Kermit Gosnell. Oh, that was the name of the abortion doctor. And then you'd see the results, 0. So it wasn't like you could say, oh, nobody wants to hear about this. No, everybody wanted to hear about it in that market. And they weren't serving their readers, they weren't serving their viewers. But I got some really interesting responses from reporters, and the one that is sort of the most well-known, it made some news, what happened was this Washington Post reporter named Sarah Cliff, who had written something like 83 different stories on 3 minor abortion-related topics. So I just asked her, you wrote 83 stories on this topic. How come you haven't covered the Kermit Gosnell issue? And she said, I feel the pat on my head through Twitter. Oh, Molly, I'm a health policy reporter. I don't cover local crime. And I feel bad for her about what happened, which was basically, I'm sure like tens of thousands of people just lost it on her. They were like, that's, she didn't even know that what she was saying was so offensive to act like what, some stupid politician says is worth 40 stories, but the actual lives of women and children are not important. And you can't imagine any abortion policy related questions about, say, health clinic regulations or, every time someone in a state legislature proposes that abortion clinics have a certain width of hallway, people go, that's just pro-lifers trying to take away abortion rights. Well, that's certainly a valid argument to present if you're a journalist. But you also want to hear about other stories, like, oh, what about that woman who died because she couldn't get out of that clinic because it was such a narrow hallway that they couldn't get the stretcher in, and when seconds count and minutes count and they couldn't get it. You don't hear that alternate side. That's a policy issue too. Regardless of what your views are on what is good policy, these things inform our policy making. So to hide these stories does damage to our civil discourse, our understanding of policy and whatnot. But yeah, so basically the outrage was so universal among so many people that finally some newspapers did, media outlets, they did cover it a little bit. Certainly not in any way worthwhile, but even the Washington Post ran a couple stories. They also wrote like an explanation of why they hadn't done it, which was fascinating. They said they hadn't known about it, that it just wasn't on their radar. And I think that speaks a lot to why you want to have more newsroom diversity, because this was like the #1 story in pro-life media for 2 years. If you don't have anyone in your newsroom who's even like remotely in touch with that huge swath of the American public, how are you going to cover those people? How are you going to cover what's interesting to them? And it's not like the Washington Post has not received criticism in the past about how they're kind of tone deaf on these issues. So you would think that they would be even more interested in having that type of diversity in their newsroom. Okay, anyway. That was a big moment for me in terms of realizing just how big the problem was for some of the media. Another big issue was with the way the media, and I'm just going to go through these things, and then I thought we could do Q&A. You might not have any questions, and I can just keep talking for hours, which I'm sure you would love. But if you do have questions, I just kind of wanted to kind of introduce the sort of lay of the land, and then we can talk about anything you want. Cardinals baseball, for instance. But a story that I covered a lot over the last couple of years was what's called the HHS mandate, or what the media frequently call the contraception mandate. And this was a fascinating look at, a media look at how stories get presented and how they bear very little relationship to what's actually happening. And so what you need to know is that Congress passed Obamacare, you might remember that. And as part of Obamacare, they basically set up a large administrative state, you might call it, which is a regulatory process whereby all sorts of new regulations and laws can be enacted. And so they set up a process by which you could make people do certain things. And they set up this committee that came up with this recommendation that you should be, you don't get like diabetes drugs for free, you don't get heart medication for free. But they were pretty sure you needed like 30 forms of contraception free from your employer. And it was just interesting that of all the things you might mandate that are important to society, that the like life-saving drugs were not in the list, but the ones that end lives or prevent life, that was like a top priority. So they came up with a religious exemption that was so narrow that, as one nun quipped, Jesus himself wouldn't qualify, because in order to get the exemption, you couldn't actually work with people who were not of your same religion. So all those of us who think that you might start a hospital and serve people who are not, you have a Lutheran hospital, but you're willing to serve people who aren't Lutheran. You have a Catholic hospital, but you're willing to serve people who aren't Catholic, and you do it because of your faith, you wouldn't qualify for the exemption. Now, the exemption has gone through tons of revisions, like all the time it's going through revisions, none of which are satisfactory to religious liberty advocates, all of which are satisfactory to the media, pretty much, which is interesting. They're always like, oh yeah, it's taken care of. This new revision, everything's taken care of. You might want to talk to the people who are suing the federal government to see if they share your opinion. But when the mandate came out, people who were interested in religious liberty were alarmed, and they were really like ringing the bells out in DC. Media didn't cover it hardly at all. And something happened, I think it was in December or January of after the mandate first came out in August. It was extremely rare, which is that every Roman Catholic bishop in the country, these people can't agree on anything, but every single Roman Catholic bishop in the country sent a letter to each parish saying, this is a huge religious liberty crisis, and we need you guys to wake up and to pay attention. I think the entire media coverage of this event, and the previous time that this happened, the only previous time in American history had to do with the Holocaust or something. It's not like they whip this out every 3 months. This is a very rare event that you would get a letter to each parish. And the entire aggregate media coverage of this was one paragraph on abcnews.com or something. And that same point in time was when Planned Parenthood lost its funding from Komen Foundation. And it was just nonstop news about that, around the clock. Even though the grand total of the grants was $300,000, not really that. Planned Parenthood is how much do they bring in each year?
Several billion.
It's at least $1 billion. I mean, they're a huge corporation, and 300,000 abortions a year. None of which was mentioned in the media coverage of this, but media was very interested in the Komen Foundation not wanting to be aligned with a group that does 300,000 abortions a year. They just couldn't even understand, why would the Komen Foundation do this? That was the tenor of the coverage. Meanwhile, this actual religious liberty battle was going down, and nobody's noticing it at all. Now, what's interesting is the people who ran Planned Parenthood's PR campaign, and it was a PR campaign, which you usually don't hear about in the media, ended up also representing someone named Sandra Fluck. And this was all within a few months. So let's cut to the, everyone in DC is political and they like to exploit things for political gain. So Republicans figured out, these people seem really angry about religious liberty. Let's see if we can hold a hearing. So they did. They held a hearing on religious liberty. They had 2 panels. The first panel were a wide variety of religious leaders. The guy who's in charge of religious liberty for the Catholics, the head of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, who has never in history, no matter who the president is, testified before Congress. So again, people are getting involved who are not normally involved in this type of thing. This Orthodox Jewish theologian, Baptist guy, I can't remember, some other Protestant. And then the second panel included people who were running the facilities that would be hurt by the mandate, 2 women who ran colleges, Christian colleges, and someone who ran a hospital or something. So as part of basically a big PR campaign, they're well, since the women aren't on the first panel, they're on the second panel, let's tell the media that there are no women there. And we're all going to stage a walkout. So as people were testifying about religious liberty, and it was interesting because I'm watching the people that I know, the religious crowd, and they were loving this religious liberty testimony. I mean, they're yes, this is great. All my female friends in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod were so excited because we've never seen our president get out there and advocate for things that we believe in like this. We were so proud, we were happy. And then we get to the news that night and it's bad men are taking away your pill. And we were wait, that is so not what we watched, but that's all that the media could understand it as because they basically accepted sort of the spin of one side of things. Now, I'm not saying that journalists should adopt anybody, they shouldn't present it just as a story about religious liberty when there are, there's other issues at play. They should present the whole story, how everybody sees it, but they were really only able to cover it from this one angle. I mentioned the Sandra Fluck thing that she shared the same PR people as the people who ran the Anti-Komen Foundation PR campaign. Because as part of the whole ruse, even though it was a panel discussion on religious liberty, the minority party wanted to have a college birth control activist. And the people who ran the panel were like, it's a religious liberty panel, we need experts in religious liberty, so maybe you can get, the guy from Americans United for Separation of Church and State for your testimony witness person. But they kind of knew what they wanted to do already, so they just went, no, we want Sandra Flock and no one else. And I mean, you guys remember the story of Sandra Flock. I mean, it's just so frustrating because that these things are all kind of manipulated in a PR sense, but it doesn't change the fact that there are literally thousands of stories about this major religious liberty crisis of our time, and they are all reduced to being about nothing more than birth control. I don't even know if people have the capacity anymore to understand this as a religious liberty issue and not as a birth control issue. Something that wasn't even, this was something invented out of legislation of Obamacare. It wasn't even part of Obamacare. It comes after Obamacare. It comes as part of the regulatory state after Obamacare. This invention that you're not free unless other people are paying for every possible form of birth control has suddenly become the only way we can understand this topic. And even people who covered religion, every time the people who are crying, this is a serious religious liberty issue, if the government can make us do this, then what can they not make us do? The people who cover religion would put religious liberty in scare quotes, as if to dismiss that this was really a religious liberty concern. I think it's fully vindicated by the fact that the Supreme Court took and is taking additional cases on this HHS mandate only as a religious liberty issue, that this is in fact, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, it's clearly a religious liberty issue. It should have been discussed as a religious liberty issue. It should have been, the voices of people who are concerned about religious liberty should have been presented with much more fairness. And, it's gone. And it's just extremely frustrating to see it all happening, and certainly there are reporters who are doing a good job covering up, but the vast majority aren't. I have another religious liberty example, but I think maybe we should have some questions. Don't all rush at once, but yes, sir.
What needs to be done to get better, more educated, civically aware journalists in this country?
It's a good question. What should be done to get more, what was it before, civically aware? Better journalists.
Yeah, better journalists.
I think first and foremost, we have to look at how we are educating people in this country. And I think that it's really not the answer anybody wants to hear, because we have to change the entire way we're educating people, because it's not working out very well. But we need to think about raising children who understand how to think clearly and coherently about everything, and who are inculcated with proper values, and who won't be so easily manipulated. And I'm worried that basically, since most people are in progressive models of schooling, it's very difficult to break out of that and be able to think about things deeply and with what they should be. Present company accepted, I'm sure, but I am struck, I was actually talking to Pastor Burhoff, that I think one of the problems actually is that a lot of media aren't that bright. I mean, it's not like the brightest minds went to journalism school, right? We're there because we can't be scientists, no. But it really is true that it's not, I mean, there are certainly some really smart people, but it's not like you're thinking those are our greatest bright lights. But I also think it's important that people who do think differently enter journalism. I think a lot of people look at it as this godforsaken profession with people who just manipulate and lie, and that's true. But that means that, like my mom said, you can serve God by serving other people just by telling the news in a straightforward manner. I don't think it's my job as a journalist to convert anybody to Lutheranism, or, you know what I mean? It's not like I'm doing that work, for evangelical reasons. I'm just doing it because I want to serve people by reporting the news fairly, giving them a new way of looking at things, introducing voices that they might not have heard. So I think it's important that people who do think differently enter the profession. They will not find it nearly so hostile as they imagine. And the more people who do it, the better. But also, I think that people could do a better job of thinking about how to talk to reporters. And a lot of people just assume they won't get good coverage, and so they just write off people. It's true that a lot of people won't give, people who have traditional understandings of morality or religion, a lot of reporters might be hostile, but not all. And I think that we should do a much better job of understanding what a reporter's job is like and how difficult it is to find stories, and sometimes just introducing them to people who they might want to profile, or introducing them to an event that's going on, giving them an opportunity to learn more about it. So there are plenty of things that everybody can do to make it better. Yes.
So do you see that as news becomes more specific and audiences become more specific to the news that they're consuming, how do you see diversity within organizations happening going forward?
Yeah. As the news kind of, the cool thing about the internet is you can have these niche publications for everything, or niche styles. Even if you just take like an issue like women's issues, you can have styles that run, the gamut from like really snarky to really academic. That's a really cool thing. And my entire website couldn't exist a few years ago. We saw a niche that needed to be filled, sort of what we were a lot of people who, were libertarians, but were interested in virtue, or were conservatives who were interested in liberty. We thought that space wasn't filled so well, so we just started it. And we can do that now in a way that you never could have done before. It was not that expensive to start. It's expensive, but not super expensive in the way it used to be to get a printing press or whatnot. And that is really great and cool. The bad part is people are also segregating their reading and viewing, and I don't think that's healthy. I try really hard not to. Sometimes I just get so frustrated with reading stupid stuff that I stop reading stupid stuff. And I'm like, no, I need to read the stupid stuff so I know what's going on out there. But if you just have a media diet that's just what you want to hear, I think that makes it harder for you to understand your fellow man and where they're coming from. It makes it harder for you to have civilized dialogue with people who have different points of view. And so I think it's incumbent upon journalists to constantly be thinking about that. I worry that we're getting worse about it, though. I almost sense like a frustration in some journalists. Like, a lot of them are young, and I think they thought they thought people would share their politics more than they do, and so they just now start to be more disdainful to general Americans, rather than thinking about how to diversify their sources or reach out to people more, or humble themselves to opening their minds to different ways of looking at things. But it's just a two-edged sword with the internet. Does that answer it, or no? Not really. No.
I guess the second part of that would be, then how do you see, when you're talking about having different voices in what sounds like more mainstream, mainline outlets, how do you see that happening in an environment that's moving so much towards a polarized, specific niche news market?
Yeah, I don't know. One of the things that's very interesting that we do out in DC is we track people's career paths as they get to the Washington Post. And frequently it's like, started out at The Nation, then went to Mother Jones, then went to Think Progress, then they went to The Atlantic, and then they went to the Washington Post. You never see the, started out at The Federalist, then went to National Review, then went to the Weekly Standard, and then went to the Washington Post. It only works, you can do that one trajectory in. And I worry that people aren't even thinking about that, the editors at the Washington Post. Actually, I was joking that I would eat my hat, your hat, and everybody's hat if there was any newsroom with any notable diversity. I don't know what I was angry about on Twitter last week, but that's what I was talking about. And this guy who is at The Economist was like, well, we have very diverse newsroom. I'm like, no, you have people who go all the way from advocating abortion on demand without apology to abortion on demand without apology to 8.5 months. That is diversity, I guess, but They don't even see that. They think diversity might mean some people are from a different country or something. Actually, my favorite thing about this that I hated was when I worked at that newspaper that covered federal government, they had this requirement that you have a journalism degree or journalism master's degree, and it wasn't a stringent requirement because I didn't have either and they hired me, but generally speaking, you had to kind of have that. And they were always desperate for diversity, by which they simply meant racial diversity. They didn't mean anything else with it, not ideological diversity or anything like that. And they were failing at it miserably because I don't know why they were failing, but they were failing. But anyway, a lot of these papers covered the military. And we had a really large support staff, including a lot of people who had served in the military and now were working in support, like bookkeeping or secretarial type stuff, who knew the newspaper business, who knew the military, and could have. You do not need even a high school education to be a reporter. You just need to know how to write and ask questions. I mean, it's like the easiest job in the world. So a lot of these people were African American or otherwise not white. Nobody ever thought, like, maybe we should train these people to become reporters. And it would have been like the easiest thing in the world. But there's something about the blinders, like you have to come through certain schools, you have to get a journalism degree, and I think it just limits them to opening their mind to how you could diversify a newsroom in multiple ways. And you know, newsrooms are notoriously not diverse on like any factor, socioeconomically, racially, ideologically. It's like a major problem. So enjoy that. But
So that really leads me to want to ask about your perceptions about whether there's a cabal, whether it is more just people wanting to be in the in crowd, whether it's ideological. What is your perception about what makes journalists so left-leaning? Because it sure affects a lot in the country in terms of community standards and such.
yeah,
And how people perceive the world.
I should have a really, I mean, I've thought about it for so long, but I should have a really good answer, but I feel like the more I think about it, the more it doesn't make sense, but I just want to use like an example of how ridiculous this is from last week. So I don't even know how this happened, but one of the guys that I work with noticed that, do you know Neil deGrasse Tyson? He's like big scientist. Everybody loves him. He had that series Cosmos on some network. He's like public scientist #1. He's like basically our Carl Sagan. And someone had noticed that he had said something in one of his presentations that was not verifiable. He had claimed something that had happened that nobody else could verify had happened. And so my colleague Sean just kind of looked into it. He was like, that guy's right. That did not happen. And he was claiming that newspaper editors don't get statistics because of a headline that was basically made up, that had never appeared in LexisNexis, which basically every headline in every publication, even from trade publications, appears in LexisNexis. It wasn't there. He did a lot of research. He couldn't find any evidence of it. And he noticed, so he just kind of like watched that presentation and noticed there was a story that the same guy had told that changed. Every time he told it, it was about jury duty, and there were some specifics about it that shouldn't have changed, but like every time he told it, it changed. So, that's interesting, because you can't really have a different... It's unlikely that you had served on 18 juries where the amount of cocaine in question had changed a little bit each time, you know? So he was like imprecise with details. And then he noticed, so he wrote these stories out. People got very angry because they really, you all love Neil deGrasse Tyson, don't you? Everybody loves him. No? Okay. Anyway, you're like, I don't even know who he is. Okay. So then he found that there was this quote that he'd been saying a lot that he claimed George W. Bush had said shortly after 9/11. So in his version of this quote, George W. Bush was trying to divide good people, Christians, from bad people, Muslim people. You all remember George Bush saying stuff like that, right? And he came up with this story about how our God is the God who names the stars. And Neil tells this story to say, like, you get what he's saying. He's saying their God didn't. And look how stupid this is. Most stars started out with Arabic names. And everybody cheers about how stupid George W. Bush is and anybody who loved him, you know. Well, it turns out George W. Bush, not only never said it, I mean, he really never said it. As you all know, George Bush was a big fan of, Islam is a religion of peace, we all have the same God, he would say stuff like that all the time. And it turned out that the quote came from after, I forget the name of the astronaut disaster that was on his watch. Do you remember? Columbia? 2003. Yeah, so it was after that happened, he had a speech where he quotes a line from Isaiah. Oh, that's the other thing. Neil said that it came from Genesis, this quote. Wrong in literally every way. It didn't happen in 2001, shortly after the terrorist attacks. happened in 2003 after a space shuttle disaster. It wasn't Genesis, it was Isaiah. And it was not a quote used to divide people, it was a quote used to say that, Isaiah says the God who, I don't remember the verse, I'm sorry. It's some verse about God naming the stars and also knowing us. And he used it to say, like, the God who names the stars knew these astronauts by name. It's a very nice presidential message that had nothing to do with what Neil deGrasse Tyson said it did. I don't know how many more examples my colleague Sean has found, but they're numerous, and it's getting bad. It's even gotten to the point where people are finally, starting to take notice, like mainstream media. What's interesting is Wikipedia. Wikipedia loves Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they wouldn't even let there be an entry about how he was fabricating quotes be on there. And I got a call from a reporter at the Daily Beast. I know this guy. I traveled to Israel with him on a trip. He's a good guy, even though he's Canadian. Just kidding, Charlize. He was like, so is it just that conservatives are anti-intellectual? Is that why you're beating up on this good guy? I was like, what the are you talking about? Like, a notable scientist who everybody says is like our #1 public intellectual is caught fabricating all sorts of quotes. The problem is not that people noticed it, and it's certainly not anti-intellectual to notice that someone's making up stories. In fact, that's kind of a big part about what you're supposed to do as a journalist or as a scientist. And maybe, I was like, maybe you should notice what's happening in other areas. Like, I see what trackbacks come into our website, and there were like 99, that I saw, no, that's not exact. That was a Neil Tyson number. That was but like from people saying like, it doesn't matter, he's our Lord and Savior who's saving us from global warming, so he gets to say whatever he wants, and these people they just don't like him. He's black, so they're probably racist. That's probably what's going on. I saw all these things like this, and I saw like one from an atheist group that was like, gotta be honest, this is a big problem. And so I told this guy, I was like, I only saw one guy do that. Like, maybe you want to look over there at the problem? Like, people aren't willing to accept what they claim to believe so importantly, that things should be rational and things should be verifiable, and like, maybe that's the problem, look over there. Oh, it didn't matter. He ran a story about how conservatives are anti-intellectual. And I was just like, anyway, for some reason I thought of that when you were asking a question, but now you have to tell me again what it was that you said, because I want to tie it together.
Well, knowing about the Alinsky method and all this and the stuff that Dinesh D'Souza put in America and that sort of thing. And it's hard not to, growing up when I did, to see this as just the methodical reinvention of America. But I suspect that in the trenches, it's not that diabolical. It's more people trying to be accepted.
Right. I think you want to refer back to the point about how stupid we are as journalists. And in order to, like, the big problem with the grand conspiracy theory is that these people just aren't smart enough to do it. But there is an issue there, which is that they do, I think, I spent like 15 minutes yelling at Tim, the guy who wrote the piece, so I feel like free to tell you what I told him, which, just about how I thought his news judgment was off. But I think partly news judgment is off because you get rewarded for having poor news judgment, basically. It's an echo chamber. People, you get a Pulitzer if you write pieces that go after conservatives. You will never in a million years get a Pulitzer for going after someone who's a favored son of the left. You just won't. So if people care a lot about that, and I don't know if I don't know who that applies to. I think it is a lot about writing to your peer group. And I notice when there are people like me who just don't care. I mean, sometimes I write stuff that makes conservatives extremely angry. Sometimes I write stuff that makes liberals angry. I don't care. It's not my concern. But some people really are concerned about that on both sides. And so I think that kind of peer signaling is a very important part of journalism today. But also, I wouldn't neglect the fact that they have different values, and they play out in fundamentally important ways. And as one, like secretly religious journalist said to me when I was writing about RFRA legislation, journalists care about the rights they use. They care about freedom of the press because they use it. They care about most free speech because they use it. They don't care about freedom of religion because by and large they're far less religious than the average population. And so they just don't care about it, they don't write about it in ways that matter. And for people who are people of faith, that's like the number one thing we care about. So that's where we see the disconnect happen most strongly. I did want to mention about RFRA legislation really quickly about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, is the way that Hobby Lobby was decided. A lot of people thought Hobby Lobby, that big Supreme Court case that came down July 1st, I think, something like that, they thought it was a First Amendment freedom of religion issue. Technically not, because Antonin Scalia, back in the 90s, a horrible decision that he authored about, in my view, I can't remember what it's called, Smith versus Employment Decision or something like that, where there were these employees of the state or federal government in Washington who were part of a Native American religion that had as a sacramental right the smoking of peyote, and they got fired because they tested positive for drug use. And Scalia wrote up the opinion saying that's fine. And everybody flipped out. I mean, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod to ACLU, everybody just was like, this is a horrible decision. If you say that you can't do your religious rights when they conflict with the laws of the federal government, we can see where that's going. And so what happened is a very liberal member of Congress named Charles Schumer authored something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was so popular that it was unanimously passed in the House, I think, and then like maybe one person didn't vote for it in the Senate, signed by Bill Clinton. This is not liberal legislation, it's like broadly popular legislation. It's been used by hundreds of people. It's a way of letting people who feel their religious liberty has been violated go to court. That's all it does. It doesn't say that if you go to court you're going to win. It just gives you a means by which you can go to court. Hundreds of different plaintiffs from every different type of religion have used it since then, and a lot of states have what are called mini RFRAs or state-based RFRAs. And a few months ago, Arizona was modifying its state-based RFRA. And the media, because now the big religious liberty issue conflicts with our most sacred thing that we all care about, which is sexual liberty. So now a lot of people who are using RFRA, it's gone from like Native Americans smoking peyote to sometimes like little old lady florist who doesn't want to work for weddings that violate her religious principles. Well, we all know those are the worst people in the world who must be thrown in jail. So now all of a sudden RFRA, because it's used by those same people to just at least get a hearing, is now considered anti-gay legislation. Not religious liberty legislation, but the media kept calling it anti-gay legislation. I wrote a piece that documented all the times that the media kept calling this anti-gay legislation, as if all religious liberty can be reduced to something like that, and as if religious liberty, because it's used by some people who you disagree with, say you don't believe in Native American religion or smoking peyote. The whole point of being American is that we disagree with each other on religious issues. I mean, you can't tolerate religion unless you disagree with it. If you agreed with it, you'd just be embracing it. So toleration assumes disagreement, right? But anyway, the media just covered it all as if it was anti-gay legislation. This was like the most horrible thing. They referred to it as Jim Crow laws, and anybody who supported it was bigoted. And I pointed out that there was a letter signed by like 12 religious liberty people, many of whom support same-sex marriage, and who are quite liberal on the topic, who were like, no, this is just a modification of a state-based RFRA to make sure that people can use it in their local communities too. And it didn't matter. The media just lost their minds. They ended up killing the legislation. Jan Brewer, who's the governor, vetoed it, which was totally ridiculous and cowardly of her in my view. And it's just a good reminder of why we need a media that understands the basics of religious liberty so they can write about it with any degree of competence, because they're not, and we're all losing religious liberty rights left and right because they just don't understand the issue or what they're giving up. The reason why I say they don't understand what they're giving up is because, in many ways, a lot of our understanding and the conception of rights is based in religious liberty. It's based in belief that people should have the right to determine truth. You cannot do that without freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press to advocate for these things. So all these things rest on freedom of religion in ways that I don't think reporters have really thought through. So as they're attacking religious liberty, they're actually attacking their own, press rights and whatnot too, but I don't think they figured that out. Yes, sir.
I remember back to journalism class in school. I had an old school instructor who said that journalism should be balanced and fair. During the first half of my life, the news reporters tended to play that charade to some degree. Now there's an overt demonstration of who people align with. They don't even hide behind the curtain and say, "Oh, of course I'm being fair." They just say, "I'm with either a liberal channel or a conservative channel." Do you think that's a positive or a negative? What do you think for the journalism industry? Is it better to attempt to harken back to some ideal of fair journalistic practices when we all know that we have personal biases? Or is it better just to come out and be overt and state who you are?
Yeah, I think I'm changing my view on this. For the longest time, I thought that everybody should strive for an objective model. I really believed that was the best way to have civil dialogue with people. I mean, I just thought it's nice when you can be confronted in a story with people who think differently than you, just to allow you to consider a different point of view, or even to sharpen your own arguments. And you can't do that if you're not, well, you can do it if you're not doing an objective model. But I really liked that, and I thought it was really good. We, of course, always pretended that that model was more real in practice than it was. When there were fewer media options, people were still letting you know, like not to be involved in the Vietnam War. They were just much craftier, subtle, and smarter about how they led you to that position. But I don't know. Now I'm kind of, I've never thought that people could actually be objective. I just thought it was something they should aim for. But now, as people are showing themselves to be unwilling to even be decent to people, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is major media outlets, from the New York Times to Washington Post to PBS, have said, we no longer think we need to be civil toward people who believe that marriage is the union of man and wife, the natural understanding of marriage, based in reproduction and sexual complementarity. They just no longer think that, like, being rational about that, not even religious, but rational, like understanding the biology, is now so bigoted they won't be given a fair shake. So when that's how far gone our mainstream media are, like, what do you do? I don't know the answer, but I am, like, happy to at least still encourage people, like at my publication, to present multiple points of view, even if it's for purpose. I mean, we don't pretend to be a mainstream media outlet. We're happy to be in this space of discussing liberty and virtue, and that's our bias, and we're upfront and honest about it. But I still want us to always be fair to other people. For me, as a Lutheran, I think about it as always putting the best construction on everything, our understanding of the commandment against bearing false witness, that we want to put the best construction on what everybody else is doing. I think that includes giving their best argument and not fighting their worst argument, but putting forth their best argument. But yeah, I don't know, I'm sorry. I don't know, it's why I can't answer that clearly, because I'm beginning to think it's just a lost cause. Yes, sir.
Looking back at this in terms of the rise of satire, especially with examples of the Daily Show, Colbert Report, in terms of having that civil discourse, that everything's just a joke to make fun of.
When I was a child, I loved the Daily Show. I mean, I thought it was brilliant. I actually have a friend who used to work on the Daily Show, just crazy liberal, but she quit in part because, I mean, I feel like people who are adults should know this, that it's clearly not in any, it's not, let me tell you what she said. Like, what her job was to take unsuspecting people who were good people and then interview them for like enough time until they said something that could be deceptively edited and they could make fun of it. It happens all the time. People have no business appearing on a show that is that mean and awful and not designed around anything truthful at all. I personally think satire works best when it's coming from the inside. Like Portlandia. Do you guys watch Portlandia? Mm-hmm. Portlandia works because you know those people love Portland, and that's why it works as satire, because they're sort of speaking from a place of love. When you're speaking from a place of hate, it just doesn't work well without being hateful. I actually just saw, I cannot believe I'm saying this because I dislike all like, Christian rock, Christian movies, Christian anything, but I've just watched a screener for something called Believe Me. It's a Christian movie. And they satirized Christians really well, and I was really happy. I mean, intentionally so. They were really ripping on like contemporary music in a way that I found just delightful. It was really great. And you could tell they were doing it because they kind of loved it. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, Daily Show, Colbert. I saw it happen enough with people where I knew that they were being manipulated and they were being treated poorly. That then I thought, well, why would I want to watch anyone be treated poorly? There was a little scandal last week because Daily Show lied to a group of people about, they said they wanted to talk to them about how they were Redskins fans. Washington, D.C. has a team called the Redskins, and this is very controversial as of 5 minutes ago because people have decided that rather than like actually do anything to help Native Americans, they would just decide that the most important civil rights issue of our time is getting Washington Redskins to have a new name. That's even though like the vast majority of people who are Native American are like, I like the name. But like white people in D.C. are very concerned. So the Daily Show had a group of people who are fans, and they said, they like specifically said, don't worry, we're not going to like confront you with anybody who's on the other side or whatnot. And it was a total ambush. And these people got angry about it. It was like, well, yeah, but you're kind of an idiot at this point if you appear on The Daily Show or Colbert. But I just have grown tired of that. But the fact of the matter is the vast majority of news that a certain segment of people are getting is in fact from The Daily Show. So yes, it affects everything. It affects like people's inability to be civil toward each other or to do anything other than roll the eyes. Or, you know, Jon Stewart's big thing is to look at the audience and they laugh. I mean, it's like almost cult-like. It's very weird. They all know when to laugh like monkeys, and I find it like really creepy and eerie. But I think every time I say anything like negative about the Daily Show, a bunch of people get mad at me because they love it so much. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's definitely affected news because it's the main way people of a certain age get their news. So it has to be dealt with. Which one? I mean, you guys should fight amongst yourselves to see.
I'm her mom, so I'll...
Yep, you would.
When you were talking about changing education, one of the things that the LCMS did as they spread across the country was to make sure that they had a school with each parish. And Lutheran education in the schools are just constricting in a very obvious way. We have none in Colorado Springs anymore. We used to have 7 at the beginning of this century. And that's like we had K through 8, then it was K through 6, then it would be K through 4. As a Christian body, what can we do as LCMS members to make that an important issue again? Because I think that the education of our children is extremely important in how they will handle all things, not just in the media, but being able to discern about political candidates and who has the better argument.
Right. Yeah, this has nothing to do with journalism or religious liberty, kind of, except it does for what you just said. But I think it's interesting to note why Lutherans have had, and still have actually, such a big network of parochial schools. The largest network of parochial schools is the Roman Catholic Church, and then right after it is the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And really, Catholics and Lutherans are kind of where parochial school education is, if it's going to be anywhere. And the reason why they set up parochial schools was because they understood that there was like a very big difference between the way Americans were educating their children and the way largely immigrant groups who were Catholic and Lutheran preferred to educate. And something happened over the course of time where Lutheran parents began to value Lutheran education less, or, I mean, it's kind of partly because the quality of the Lutheran schools declined as they adopted progressive models of education. If you're going to do progressive model of education, why not just go to a government school? They're going to do it with more money. They're going to have more athletics. I mean, why not just do it? So if you're going to do distinctly Lutheran education, it should be something that looks different and truly is fundamentally different than government schools. And I think the best model, and I know that's been tried probably also in Colorado Springs, is classical education, which is what my children go to. And The big problem with it is it's a lot of work to set up and maintain a classical Lutheran school. It's based on the trivium, an understanding of matching education to where children are at each stage of the process, and kind of exploiting their natural gifts at a given age. My kids are just in the soak up everything like a sponge stage, so they just get all the vocabulary, whether it's the vocabulary of math or the vocabulary of language, or learning letters or whatever. And then they will progress into different stages that also match. Like, one of the great things is that the Missouri, one of the horrible things, I meant to say, that the Missouri Synod does is confirm people at the age precisely when you should actually be teaching them like refutation courses, so that they're just, you know, is anyone here 14? So, you know how we all were at that age. Horrible, right? Like, you just want to fight with everybody, and that's when we confirm people, which is just such a weird age to confirm people. You know, maybe confirm them earlier and then get them into a course where they can like turn that natural good juice of wanting to fight everybody against people who deserve to be fought. So classical education kind of exploits those natural tendencies of where kids are at a given time to make them more educated people. But I think the big problem is parents, you people. And no, I think that like they don't value things like they should, and they think things are going to be fine if they just, like, I don't know why we assume that things are going to be fine if we don't really take our children to church or instruct them in the faith at home and also send them to a government school. I mean, like, why would that work out well for you? It doesn't work well for anybody, right? So, I wish parents would kind of think through that a little bit more and think about how important education is. Or even like, I find it so funny how we obsess so much about college, when so much education is done prior to college too, and so many colleges are so bad at wasting your time, and we spend so much money on them, and they don't really give you an actual education. It's like something that looks like an education. And, sorry, I'm going off. But I wish parents would care more about it because it's very important, and it's also a challenge because no parent can do it on their own. It needs to be like kind of a widespread movement of parents who care and who understand the problems with the progressive model of education and why it has so consistently failed people over the course of many decades. So that's cheerful.
She actually gets it because she homeschooled me, so.
Oh, great.
I actually wanted to bring it back to the education too, but a different side of it. You and I are very weird. I don't know if anyone else here noticed that she's weird, but you're.
Some members of my family are here, so they could tell you
Yes.
more than the class.
A confessional Lutheran female in journalism is weird. A confessional Lutheran female in politics is weird. How do we get more confessional Lutheran females outside into actually affecting religious liberty issues in the public sphere, whether it's through journalism or politics or some other medium?
I have a totally different perspective because where I live, it's totally normal. I mean, everyone in my church is like me. We're all doing different things. Like maybe we're working as attorneys, maybe we're working on persecution of Christians, maybe we're working on the Hill, we're working in journalism, lobbyists, whatever. But we're all like this. Maybe your problem is where you are right now. But no, I really think that. I mean, like there are tons of great lay people, and I think partly it is a problem that Lutherans sometimes are very quiet about things when they shouldn't be. I mean, I recently went to a function that had a bunch of people, Lutherans on the Hill, and I was like, wait, you're a Lutheran? I had no idea. And even I'm like the most outspoken Lutheran in an annoying way all the time. And I worked with someone for years who was also confessional Lutheran, and we didn't know it until we both like ended up at the same church one day. I was like, how did that happen? You know, because we have like, you have those friends that think like every moment is a moment to work on conversion of their fellow man. Like my favorite one was the pilot a few years ago who had just come back from a revival, and he was really convicted, as they say. And so he told everybody, he got on the loudspeaker on the plane. This is post 9/11, I just want to say. Got on the loudspeaker, asked everybody who was not Christian to raise their hand. People were like, and then he was like, Christians, convert. Like, do it. That was your opportunity. And everybody was like, are we going to die? Are they just bringing us down? And Lutherans are like not going to do it that way. We're going to like maybe introduce something if we become friends with someone. But that, you know, that we can tend to be, our understanding of vocation sometimes makes us complacent, I think, and keeps us from, understanding that no one else is going to do it, we have to do it, and doing public service like politics and journalism is actually a great way to serve your neighbor, a great way to serve God by serving your neighbor. So probably pastors should talk about it more, and
He's sitting right
parents, great.
there. He actually does a really good job of that. I'm very blessed in my church.
Are you aware of what's going on in the public square initiative in El San Luis?
I am.
What's the update on that?
I don't know what
Haven't
the,
heard much lately.
I think it's going pretty well. So they're raising money to set up an office in DC that will be focused on religious liberty issues and also important life issues, sanctity of life issues. And I think they're probably almost ready to go. I don't know what that means almost though. Like, it's a long process to raise the final funds probably. It's a very expensive endeavor to actually do it. And, but I think is really important to know is that even without an office being set up there are tons of Lutherans working out there. And we all do talk to each other. And we do connect. And I mean, one of the most inspirational and important people working on religious persecution of Christians is a young Lutheran woman who, actually she said she was in church in St. Louis and was visited by, her church had President Matt Harrison speaking, and he was saying, you need to get out and like actually do things. And she just said, you know what, I'm gonna do it. So she picked up and moved to DC, and she works on really important issues. I mean, she has saved people's lives. She is, but it's not the kind of name you're gonna like hear about, because a lot of what she does is extremely sensitive. But it is happening, and there are attorneys who work in religious liberty issues. Tons of attorneys actually work in religious liberty issues, and they file amicus briefs on all the important religious liberty cases. So I actually just wish that maybe the Synod would do a better job of telling people what is going on. I mean, even when President Harrison did his really good job testifying in front of the committee, I mean, they were in contact with all the Lutherans. The whole way it got set up was because of Lutherans knowing that he would be available. They were looking, when you set up a panel, you're looking for people who can represent diverse interests. It was because Lutherans were there that they were able to take part in that. I mean, it's really happening, and it's also, there's just like a nice, vibrant network of young people who meet regularly for scripture study and study the confessions, who are also in that Hill, Washington, D.C. thing. So. Yes, sir.
Do you think that based on the projected bias that we see, that the journalists are kind of weeded out, they don't try to get into the industry right on get both sides of their shake because they don't think they'll get their shake?
I think a lot of people with certain, I think a lot of people don't enter the industry because they think it would be so hostile to them that it would not be a good idea. But that's actually not true. But I don't think that it weeds out good people necessarily. I think that if you're compelled to be a journalist, you'll be a journalist regardless. It's just that we're far outnumbered by people who have like radically different perspectives on things. But, yes, ma'am.
So with your perspective on the Daily Show and satire there, how do you feel like?
I realized I sounded like the angry old man who's like, get off my lawn, Jon Stewart.
How do you see the other side of that when you're talking about maybe conservative talk radio or Fox News talking about it? Do you see that as a valuable input, like a valuable perspective in the argument giving another side, or do you see it as more venom that's just being thrown into the
Yes, both. The thing I always thought was really great was what Roger Ailes said. People were like, wow, this Fox News is really taking off. What was your secret? And he was like, oh, I had the idea that maybe one network should be able to serve the 50% of the country that's conservative. And it's like, oh yeah, they were kind of left out before he started. So it serves like a very valuable need of just getting conservative voices out there. And I do TV, and I'm not good at it or happy about doing it, and I don't like the way that like you have to take really thoughtful ideas and boil them down to 20 seconds. That's true of CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. It's just true of the medium. It's not just any one outlet. But yeah, also I think that I actually just met this really good producer at Fox News, and he does really thoughtful documentaries, which, I don't know, I mean, he's done really interesting stuff on like healthcare, really balanced stuff, but he had said something about like how when he first started I think he started at ABC. He said that his boss told him, people don't want to be informed. They want the appearance of being informed. And I think that's true of everything, not just broadcast media, but it's true of every media. We want to feel like we're informed when frequently we just want confirmation of our values. That's not all bad. I mean, sometimes it's very good just to get like a better understanding of what your beliefs are, because your beliefs are fine anyway. But I do worry about how, it just creates echo chambers where people aren't going to be hearing really thoughtful arguments from other people. But related to that, one of the things that we noticed at the Federalist when we started was that we're actually completely populist. I mean, meaning we're not elite at all. Most media is very elite, and they signal to each other that they're elite and they're smart and whatever. We're happy populists. We kind of have more faith in the common man than every single person inside the Beltway. And yes, I live inside the Beltway, so take that for what it's worth. But what we noticed was that a lot of elite conservative media is presented well. So something like Weekly Standard, where my husband works, and National Review, they're presented very well. They're very thoughtful arguments, but they're elite opinions. And then if you go to the populist sites, they're just maybe like there's a kernel of really good idea, but there's lots of yelling and anger and vitriol and the kind of thing you wouldn't ever share an argument with someone like, hey, read this thing at this site. The moment your liberal or moderate friend goes there, they're like, oh my gosh, yikes, And so what we wanted to do was kind of combine the best of both things, like have thoughtful pieces that are not elite but conservative. So I think there's actually probably room for something like that in broadcast media now. Fox News has done such a good job of like breaking open the market wide and opening people's minds about what's possible. You don't have to do the same model of pretending you're objective when really you're liberal, and you can actually like meet a different audience because not everybody is that New York Times type audience. So I would not be surprised if a conservative outlet went for a more like still being conservative but being much more what I'm saying, just maybe more open to different types of arguments. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming, Molly. What is your website, please, and what is the Federalist website?
Okay, my website is the Federalist website, and it's thefederalist.com. And I don't have a personal website, but most of my stuff is there now. And I will be, actually, it's on my to-do list and has been since the birth of my first child to get a website going. She's in 2nd grade now, and I'm a little bit worried it's not going to happen at any point, but hopefully it will happen soon.
And can we come to your dad's retirement celebration, and when is that?
Okay, Dad is retiring on Sunday, and it's in Castle Rock at Mount Zion, and I know nothing else about the details. Anyone? 9 a.m. service. Luncheon at 11:30. He's requesting gifts of tequila. Just kidding.
Your old blood.
Great. Great. Oh wait, sorry, one more.
What's your advice for daily news readers in light of the current just biosphere of opinions and papers? And I mean, I can go on Google News and pull from 100 different newspapers. What is some advice you can give us from the inside about getting a fuller picture of any one story?
Okay, it's so hard because there's so many options, like you said. You go online and there are hundreds of stories that you can get from anything. I think that the most important thing that you need to do as a news consumer, as a viewer or a reader, is just develop a very strong critical instinct for everything. Like, it used to be said in journalism, back when people did journalism, that if your mother says she loves you, check it out. It's good advice in the case of my mother, because you are never really certain. I'm just kidding. But my mom is like the funniest, most awesome lady, so I hope that I didn't. I'm just teasing. But so you're supposed to check everything out. And I think that if you just start approaching, like there's this saying, I forget what they call it, like Gelman something hypothesis, where if you read a news article about something that you have any level of knowledge about, you frequently go, this is all wrong, this is crazy, I mean, that's not how it happened at all. I mean, there's something really weird about when you actually go to an event and you read the thing that they said, and you're like, that bears no relationship to what happened. Or you're an expert in a certain field of study and you read a piece about a new development in your field of study and you go, that's completely wrong. But then you flip the page and you're like, oh, so that's what's happening in Syria. You just become gullible the next moment when you start that next article. And I think the most important thing you can do as a news consumer is just be deeply, deeply critical of everything. I think because I have such contrarian views, I was always able to do that even as a kid, reading the Rocky Mountain News and Denver Post. Denver used to have 2 newspapers, you're probably not going to remember that, and so I would just kind of naturally hone that instinct, like, I know that's wrong, I know that's wrong, I know that's wrong. But people really need to internalize that and question everything. I don't want to sound like a hippie right now, but question authority, man, that's what you gotta do. But you really have to just think and also, what I always do is think about triggers. Am I hearing the best argument from the other side right now? That doesn't strike me as the best argument. Or, gee, I knew a conservative once and they didn't seem that crazy. Just whatever it is that kind of you can hang on to, to question everything, can help you find the other sources that you might be interested in. But the good news is, there is not just the New York Times. And the good news is the New York Times is being much more clear about the fact that it has an agenda. There are other media outlets. And I would say if you find a good story, you find a good reporter, just start following that reporter. Maybe follow them on Twitter and see who they link to or who they like. There really are good journalists out there. There's no quick and dirty, easy way to find them, but being critical is the number one thing. Yes. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.